Okay, I think we can get started. Okay. Welcome everyone firstly to LSE, but also to the Eden Centre, which I'll talk about in a minute. And also welcome to this seminar on re-envisioning future learning and workspaces. Before we start the seminar, I just want to say a little bit about the Eden Centre and the work we do at the Eden Centre. Especially for those that are coming into the seminar from outside LSE, you may not have come across the Eden Centre so far. It's the LSE Centre of Education Expertise. We support and enable the development of high quality and inclusive education in the social sciences, obviously because we're at LSE. We've got a number of different areas of work that we engage in, including curriculum enrichment, digital innovation, academic staff development, inclusive education, and student partnerships. Should have moved on to my slide actually. And yeah, there are some examples of the kinds of activities that we do in the Eden Centre, and it's a team made up primarily of academic developers, learning technologists, and technology specialists, and other specialists in areas such as student partnerships. About our work in the area of learning spaces, we, in various forms, now the Eden Centre have been involved in development and the design of learning spaces at LSE for quite a while now. I first got involved probably around 2015 when I was part of we were a learning technology team, and so that's how the Eden Centre formed. The learning technology team essentially joined with the academic development team to form the Eden Centre, and so now that work has carried on. So the Eden Centre works with colleagues around the school, obviously primarily including estates, DTS, that's our IT services division within LSE, and other teams. And the idea is to improve teaching and learning spaces around the school. Since about 2018, we've embarked on a 10-year programme of improvements, and that's primarily focusing on existing teaching and learning spaces. So that includes the classrooms and the lecture theatres, but also those open spaces where students do independent informal study. So we've done a lot of work in that area. And a lot of that work and the work around the classrooms and lecture theatres and the thinking around that has fed into the discussions and the design of the new buildings. So it's all kind of linking up. And obviously those new buildings being a couple of years ago, the Marshall building, the Centre building, and most recently the Marshall building, which you may have come across, was recently the subject of an article in The Guardian. And so why are we running this seminar particularly? It's the second in a new series of seminars. We've just established the Eden Education Futures series of seminars, and it seems this one's quite timely as we hopefully make our way out of the pandemic, fingers crossed. We start to think about returning to the campus, and it's a good time to reflect on the experience of the last nearly 2 years and think about how we want to use our physical spaces in conjunction with the online space. And so it's really good that we've got some visitors today to kind of just throw out some ideas and take us through some of those thoughts. So before I introduce our speakers, I just want to say a little bit about the structure of the session. Our speakers are going to talk for around 20 minutes. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat, and I'll try and compile them and have them ready at the end. But if you do want to ask a question directly, come on camera and ask a question, please raise a hand at the end after the speakers have made their presentation. So our speakers today are John Rylance and Liz Jarrett from ADP Architecture. They're going to talk through about how we're thinking, as I said, about learning and workspaces in our current and future contexts. John leads on around HE and research sectors for ADP. He's advised around 30 plus clients. ADP have won Guardian HE Facility of the Year, Cubo, is that right? Student Project of the Year, and SCONAL, that's the University Libraries Association, University Library of the Year. John promotes design knowledge sharing and chairs various practice groups, sharing new ideas around space optimization, the social value of spaces, teaching and learning environments, sustainability and well-being of those in those spaces, student experience and smart campus as well. So at this point, I'll hand over to you, John.
Great, thank you, Kris. If it's okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Excellent. I think, are you able to see my desktop? Is that what you can see on the screen?
Yep, I can see everything on your desktop.
Excellent. There's always that moment when you think, oh goodness, everyone can see absolutely how tidy I am. So I'm just going to go to full screen. Great. I'm hoping, I'm just going to scroll back a bit. I'm giving away everything you're going to see now, I've realized, by not having on the first page. Hopefully everyone can see that first image as a way of an introduction to our presentation today. As Kris has said, we've as a practice, we've been very lucky that we've worked with over 50% of the universities in the UK over many years. And my job is exclusively working with the universities across the sector. And we wanted to bring to you some of our perspective of those conversations, those engagements, those sessions of workshop sessions that we've had with universities throughout the last couple of years in a world that is changing in terms of a pre-pandemic move towards more blended learning and more on-site and online content being blended together, and what that impact has had in terms of thinking about the physical campus and the facilities that are needed in the future. So I'm hoping to present today, just in terms of the general headlines, is just an overview of various typologies of space that we're engaged in across the sector in terms of delivery. Starting with the smallest, which is about general teaching spaces, the 360-degree classroom. Moving through hybrid spaces and typologies that blend work streams, workplaces together with learning spaces, and a concept that we've crystallized as our own concept called third space. Talk a little bit about workplace and how we're now seeing some of our workspace concepts about hybrid working and hoteling of space. We're seeing that impacting on both professional services staff and academic staff in terms of the types of spaces that are required in the future and how they're actually manifest in some of our current projects. A little bit about technology and how technology is supporting not only pedagogy and teaching, but also how technology is helping to manage that transition to sort of online and on-campus management of staff, student and visitors, and how that can assist us in the future in terms of student experience. And finally, just a couple of examples of how we're seeing universities themselves across the sector evolve towards accommodation that has greater social purpose. And what we mean by that is where the institution itself, in terms of its mission for greater good, is supporting not only the student body and staff in terms of health, well-being and welfare and future employment and enterprise, but also social purpose in terms of greater connections with wider communities, and what that means in terms of the look and feel of the campus, in terms of the spaces that are now being potentially shared with third parties. So as a little bit of background, I'm just going to move, I've got all your thumbnail pictures right over my text, which is a bit schoolboy error, so I'm going to move that to one side so I can see it. starting just as a little bit of background in terms of setting the scene of the sector. The LSC and all universities have, by various degrees, looked at return to work strategies. We understand that you've engaged with pulse surveys, various town hall discussions about the nature of that return post-COVID. And we're going to share with you, as part of this presentation, some of the specifics in other institutions and the way that they have approached that. One important message that we've heard across the sector is, although there is an expectation of more nomadic and hybrid working for both staff and students, the incredible importance of the relationship between educators and students, and the importance of that contact time, both online but also physically on the campus, and also the relationship between the value, the social value of being with your peers in a physical space. One of the challenges that throws up for administrators, for timetablers, for educators, is about understanding the use and utility of non-timetabled space. And it's a significant issue as we move towards more blended learning, more autonomous and group working, less timetabled activities and sort of didactic teaching that you would see on a campus. So the kind of management and understanding and feedback of an institution now has to put into place to try and get the right facilities in the right places, because there's more emphasis on student, staff and public choice of the spaces that they use. And as I described in the summary, also the changing nature of the social purpose of the institution and the social value and asset and the use of space. You know, it is no longer for one single use; it has greater utility. So, you know, what is the value of a physical campus? Well, it's a question that the sector's been asking itself pre and post COVID about, you know, as we've seen an emergence of more online curriculum and degrees. What is the value about returning to campus and having that social experience? Well, we kind of workshopped it with a number of universities, and there's an obvious short list of benefits, which is about a social network where you develop skills, critical skills, analytical skills. You are able to create, bounce off ideas, collaborate. It's about building confidence, something that, you know, a lot of people that are working online remotely, they're not able to have that kind of empathetic relationship and develop confidence in their skills and their delivery. And it's obviously an ongoing story of knowledge exchange over knowledge transfer. So moving away from more kind of didactic, sage on stage teaching to more knowledge exchange of flipped learning, blended learning, and conversations and critical thinking about knowledge. And it's also why go to a university. It's about belonging, it's about identity, it's about team culture and experience. So all of those things need to be manifest in the type of facilities that you see in a future university. And the next slide highlights just a summary of all the typologies of space that, in fact, this is a list that was provided to us by the University of York, having conducted a series of studies and back to work surveys, that they concluded that everything that an institution is involved in is effectively work streams, whether it's learning, study, teaching, research, home working. And they separated out those work streams into individual projects to think about how they could improve things across the board in all aspects of the experience of the campus, and also aligned with their online curriculum. So I thought I'd start with just some images of a 360-degree classroom, and this really concentrates on you know, a pure teaching space. What we're seeing is obviously a need for a greater variety of teaching spaces across the campus. So the kind of 30-person seminar room is still an aggregate that's used throughout the sector. But we're now seeing a blending of those spaces into more active learning spaces. So spaces in which you can exchange ideas, be more active, where you've got empathy zones within that space where students are working on their individual learning in different ways in a 360 environment. So it's an educator in the center of the room. It's moving away from a kind of, the sage, the didactic kind of leader of the group, and it becomes a more democratic space. So this is a concept that ADP delivered pre-COVID 2 or 3 years ago, which was to help universities think about the nature of future learning spaces and teaching spaces. So everything that you see in this image is about supporting students with mirroring their work on interactive screens, the increasing use of immersive technology in teaching and training experience, using gaming technology to support that, the importance of health and well-being and environment and the impact on the classroom. And just anecdotally, in the back of the image, this concept was developed in parallel with a project that we were doing at the University of Liverpool Medical School. And you can see in the back, there's a human heart on the back screen in the immersive space. And that is real in the fact that that has been developed out at the medical school because surgeons approached the medical school initially, the university, to say, we need to do some work on scanning children's hearts, and we want to be able to reduce risk and plan for those operations more efficiently. So we'd like to be able to 3D VR this experience before we go and carry out the operation. So in conjunction with the university, the teaching hospital, and Daresbury SciTech, gaming technology was used to scan hearts, develop the models, and then not only is that a utility for the hospital, it's also now part of the student experience of training the medical students by using that technology and that immersive technology in their curriculum. A couple of completed examples. So this is York University in Toronto. This is an engineering building, but you can see, the DNA of that idea in terms of 360 classroom of projectors and people working in the rooms in different ways and different pathways, working on different projects, and the ability to use flexible furniture to create different pedagogy within the working environment. And the second example is Oregon State University, which is not dissimilar on the right-hand side of a similar type of 360 classroom environment. But also adjacent to that space, there are some larger, more kind of collaborative flat floor teaching spaces that are a mixture of kind of amphitheatre, Harvard-style lecture spaces, and the ability to move flexibly and create different cohorts and different arrangements of furniture within that space, all supported by 360 technology, which projects on all the surfaces higher in the teaching space. So I'm going to move on now to a kind of hybrid of that teaching space, learning space, and workspace in a concept called third space. And that is a hybrid between the two. And we came up with this concept a couple of years ago in direct response to the question of what is a post-COVID space that staff and students would need in the future. What would attract them, and what are the kind of facilities that you would have on campus that would nurture them? And we came up with this idea of third space being two things. One, it's an equation, and the second thing, it's a typology. And the idea of it being an equation is there's an opportunity through the whole remapping of a campus to think about the nature and efficiency of utilization of space and think about it in a different way. So it's effectively re-engineering existing spaces to become more optimal to their use, to a modern use, which in itself, the combination of spatial efficiency and also rotation through timetabling and hoteling of space and booking and hot desking means that a cohort of 100, you might have at any peak time only 80 occupants in the same space, so you design it for 80. So that kind of combination of space utilization and timetabling and better sort of team management results in a contraction of the needed space to be able to carry out those functions successfully. And the result of that, you get, out of those 2/3, a third to reinvent a different type of space that is more specific to future needs. That also affects, and you can see that also in teaching spaces, in the way that teaching spaces are changing from predominantly lecture theatre spaces, tiered lecture theatres, to more collaborative lecture theatres on the right-hand side, and also teaching spaces in which you can create different pedagogies of different arrangements of furniture, and you can break rooms and pull them together. So already that kind of greater utility, greater than the sum of its parts, is already happening. And if you combine that with new technology, which is supporting kind of holographic lecture theatres and the ability to bring people online to also into a physical space, you can see the advantage of that kind of flexibility. So we've seen the equation. What's the typology? So our idea was that it's the kind of activity space of that networking, socializing, everything we outlined previously is about where a space where its context becomes its content. In other words, everything that's in that environment, the AV that you use, the walls that you can write on, the space that you can configure, the furniture that you can organize, is something that can be controlled not only by the educator but also by the students themselves, to empower them to create their own pedagogy and to have that kind of exchange of knowledge and problem solving within certain spaces. So we stole that line from the Stanford Design School, and fits quite well in terms of the concept we're now going to show you. I won't read everything out on the slide, but this is a kind of a word dump of everything that we kind of picked up of what this future concept should try and crystallize and manifest within its design. So it's everything from very active spaces of crucibles of ideas sharing and hubs and connections, to more quiet spaces for autonomous working or quiet contemplation. The ability to make more connections with the outdoors is very important in a post-COVID world. The sanctity of public realm and access to the outdoors has become really important as a result of COVID. So the ability to make connections both inside and outside has become really important in our thinking about these kind of spaces. And something Alina, Director of Estate, said to us about, kind of spaces that break down the scale of the campus for an undergraduate, kind of spaces where they feel a sense of identity. So these potentially could be pockets of space, they could be associated with schools and departments, or they could be coalesced together into major student centres or support spaces. So a really simple idea of how you create a model. You saw the teaching space concept. This is a similar kind of a floor plate. The darker colors relate to indoor spaces, the lighter colors to outdoor spaces. And seamlessly, those two things kind of connect together. And it's creating zones within a floor plate and recognizing a kind of movement and a kind of a point of gravity in which students will coalesce around a kind of kitchen table or a place to have a cup of coffee and meet, while they then go out and radiate into certain working environments. And the idea that this could be a kit of parts, it could be something that all of these things are bespoke items, or be a combination of readily available furniture in which you could combine, you could change. So the idea of a ribbon, of a kind of a platform and a podium spaces that may celebrate gaming technology, that you've got configurable walls that you can close and create different kinds of pedagogy, walls that you can write on, walls that you can move, all within the same concept. So these are some images from a 3D animation similar to the previous concept of, these are stills from a video. It's a 360 spin view, which we share with our clients to say, perhaps these are the kind of things in terms of activity-based learning spaces that you might want to introduce into general social areas, perhaps. And you could, your choice is infinite in terms of how you could fit those out into an existing space or perhaps into a new build project. But the idea that there may be more kind of activity-based, kind of Fab Lab activity areas within, learning through creativity, more kind of work orientated problem solving types of spaces. So we've kind of thrown the kitchen sink at it in terms of an idea about how those things could be manifest in a future project. The other important thing that's become really important through the experience of COVID is health and well-being. The isolations of staff and students, and thinking about when staff and students and visitors are on campus, the quality of their environment that they're experiencing. So, doing away from horrible dead-end corridors and isolation, and trying to open up spaces and make greater connections with the outdoors. So the idea of just being able to geo-locate ideas around natural ventilation, light, ventilation, access to water, all sorts of nutrition, all sorts of things that can go into the thinking about a kind of an overlay of a design, an emerging design of a learning space that, you know, kind of is a benchmark measure of that. That then extends to an idea around how those social spaces could be connected within a building, whether it's an existing building or new. So this is showing some of those evolving ideas about how those things would then connect within a building potentially. So there's always a connection in terms of rule of a sort of pre or post space, education space, third space next to a specialist teaching or non-specialist teaching space. So it's a kind of breakout pre and post. It's an area where students could congregate. And by creating social ribbons through buildings, you start to think about buildings in 3 dimensions and not just thinking about those social spaces being on a ground floor of a building where most people congregate. The ability to be able to make those connections throughout the building, and also sort of setting rules about how you might connect with atrium spaces or winter gardens or greenery or balconies and destination spaces. And just thinking about the connections with the outdoors, upstairs, upper floors of buildings is also important. And that particular concept you saw just in a design for the University of Huddersfield, and it just shows, you know, how that early thinking of that social ribbon, you know, has actually informed a design about how those things are connected throughout a building. And this is a building for health and social care, so there's lots of members of the public that are actually going to be in this building. So that shows that sort of thinking around the nature of social learning space and how it and where it locates within future buildings. Just wanted to touch a little bit on smart technology, and as architects, we're now becoming much more involved in early planning of learning and teaching spaces from 2 aspects. One is the technology and AV that supports that teaching and learning experience, but also the building management itself that informs the experience of that building. And you're going to see that more in the future. So it's everything from a kind of visitor management and having a totem that will recognize you from your phone as you turn up into the building and says, "Hi, John, we've booked seminar 3. We've set up the AV for you. We've configured the FF&E. We've put the coffee machine on for you. We've booked you a place at the cafe or a workspace later in the day." All of those things will be a seamless blend of online planning and management and the booking and use of, you know, intelligent smart booking of space in the future. This is just an example of, you know, how just using furniture, never mind, you know, the articulation of bespoke designs that we showed you within third space, the ability to create different pedagogy and configurations of spaces that you will recognize in teaching throughout a floor plate. So a move towards in the future, you know, the optimum of flexible open spaces that can adapt and change to different teaching methodologies, that can adapt to different research programs within institutions. You're going to see much more change in terms of the furniture and AV support necessarily than massive configurations of buildings themselves. And there's such a drive within the market now towards, you know, adapt and reuse of buildings driven by sustainability concerns and carbon commitments, that we're going to see more refreshing and reuses of those kind of spaces. So the adaptability and flexibility of environments is going to be really important. And this is quite a messy diagram, but a series of pictures, but this is Stanford Design School. But it shows about, you know, how students can not necessarily own space, but they can define their own pedagogy, create an ownership of it, or for a short time an area of a space to work on particular projects and work together on problem solving. And it is inherently messy in a creative school like the Stanford Design School, but you can see there's lots of uses of space. So on the bottom left, you know, their bootcamp space is used for everything from exhibitions to TED Talks to staff meetings, and that kind of sense of community of different flexibility and utility of space in terms of that learning experience. I'm now going to just touch, and the final part is just a little bit about workspace. So another concept that we came up with in a whole kind of suite of future spaces was to think about academic workplace. And this has actually informed our third space concept, but moving towards cohorts of staff or researchers, principal investigators within universities that have a sense of human scale to them. And we came up with an idea around, the house and the home, and what's in the house and the home in terms of a kind of Goldilocks size of how people optimally work together. I'm sure you all have experienced a room where you look on a Wednesday afternoon and there might be one person in it in the corner, isolated on their own, or people that are kind of locked away in cellular offices in big rooms that are not the right size. There's never a perfect fit. But to create spaces that, with a blank piece of paper, that might be a combination of a series of fluid zones and scenes that support activity. And most of our workplace work is now related to those kind of thematic thinking about how space is being used as workspace, whether it's professional services, academic, or indeed students themselves. So everything in the foreground of this image is about social connections and a front room and a bookable meeting room as a front room, and everything in the background of this image is around quiet working and carousels and more confidential conversations, and a kind of kitchen table. So the kind of language of a house and home and a terrace, and then a kind of village green almost, which could be the third space outside of these spaces in terms of how these spaces might connect within a building. So finally, just a couple of examples of how that's kind of manifest, all these concepts that you've seen, how they manifest in real projects, and perhaps some synergies in how you're looking as an institution about future space. University of York appointed us on the back of Third Space over a year ago, and we've just completed their pilot professional services hub. The idea behind the professional services hub is a pilot space for all professional services activities on rotation to experience what it's like to work in these kind of environments, and then to replicate those environments across the university campus. A strategic decision not to coalesce them all together, but to place them throughout the university to create a sense of community and have a connection with staff and students in support functions. So there are kind of two areas hierarchy in terms of the space, one public facing and one more private and confidential. So the image on the left-hand side, there's a bigger image in a moment, is where students might come to discuss HR issues or finance issues or administrative issues. So how that welcoming space becomes a workplace and then kind of blends into a more kind of private, secure space, which I'll show you in a second. All the notes on the right-hand side relate to the university's own manifesto of what it wanted to do in terms of the creation of these hubs across the campus, working on about, I think, 60% maximum occupancy at any one time in professional services, but 80% expectation of staff on campus, academic staff. So there's much more emphasis on interaction with fellow staff and, of course, students, and the importance of that connection. But then that model being based on occupancy and then rolled out across the university. And they came up with a brief to us to say, well, these are the key things for us, is experiencing workplaces that are about team working, being part of something important, the ability to create, socialize, learn, teach, but there's also spaces for the individual. Some of that obviously is around home working or on campus or nomadic working, but it's also about, the improving of work-life balance for everyone in the community of the university. And they asked themselves the question, well, do we need an office in the future? And they came to a conclusion, and these are their words, that it is incredibly important for all sorts of things in terms of corporate values of institutions, the idea of, the kind of heart and soul and value of an institution of coming together as a cohort, and the importance of, corporate knowledge and social capital being incredibly important. So how is this being managed? Well, they've introduced Slack as a software program to assist them. I'm not sure if you guys have looked at that, but that software is assisting them in the planning of activities around projects, and those projects are online projects that then are also about timetabled activities present on campus, which is quite an interesting thing to be trialing. Also, we looked at Robin as another software, which is on the top left of this image, which is about booking and hoteling of hot desking within spaces and creating teams. So you engineer people sitting next to each other on particular days and having access to particular facilities and meeting rooms and training rooms, which is quite interesting. And on the right-hand side is just some feedback that we had pages and pages of survey information, demographic information, and views on what the nature of returning to work for both staff and students would be. And here's very quickly, I'll canter through this on conscious of time, but so this has now been built. This is kind of the public side of the building. We can send you links where you can see a sort of 360 spin view of this space if you'd like to see it off a QR code. Beyond a kind of an area where there's a retractable screen is the main area of the professional services hub. On one side, it's more active, and rows for hot desking. On the other side of the central spine, you can see on the left, there's a quiet zone. So it depends on which side of the spine that you work. But the central zone, you'll see some similarities between our sort of third space concept, where there's a demonstration room, there's a create space, there are various pods. There are pods for broadcasting, joining webinars, and all of the areas within the building are based on activities. So kind of prep areas for digital lockers, refresh areas in terms of refectory space, all those kind of things are thought of as terms of activities within the work zone. And other technologies that we're seeing integrated within our projects. In fact, the previous image that you saw was trialed as an idea of a holographic lecture theatre, which at London Business School has been adopted. But window of the world technologies, the ability to create communities online, both online and physically within teaching spaces, is becoming more commonplace. And that's quite an exciting thing, not only because it brings people to listen, but it also gives them the ability to talk. And one of the things that we find in most institutions is the program of that public good, of the need to be able to talk and broadcast and be ambassadors for their institution and talk about real world problems. So having these kind of environments that give you a platform to the entire world are really important. And that can be in front of a laptop in a coffee shop, but it also could be in these kind of spaces. And a couple of more examples talking about Imperial and that holographic lecture theatre space on the top right. And then to the left-hand side, Valeric Business School, which is a really interesting kind of activity-based work business school in terms of integration of IT and pedagogy. Just finally, I think I'm pretty close to finishing. Just a couple of projects around the idea of sort of social value and worth and institutions. Not too far away from you in Marylebone, we're working on a project for which is called an Inclusive Enterprise Centre, which is a former office building purchased by the university. And its sole purpose, it has no expansion plan in terms of growth of department or faculty. Its sole purpose is to create a new space for the exchange of inclusive enterprise. So it supports students into the world of work. It has incubation units in it in terms of business setups. It's got clinics in it to support both students and the wider community. But it becomes a community focus. It's on the periphery of the campus, and it allows the community and is encouraging the community to be drawn into the building, to use the facilities and being part of that community in terms of its wider social purpose. So you can see on the image, we've got broadcasting spaces, we've got a world of work rooms, cafe on the ground floor, and further up the building, lots of opportunity to create events and conference spaces, which is quite exciting in terms of a repurposing of a building. And the final one I think I've got is this is another interesting thing where we've taken effectively an empty shop front in Liverpool for Liverpool's John Moores. That public good of creating two things. One is an enterprise team academy space for local businesses and for the students on one side of the building, and the other is a law clinic. And that law clinic is set up as a practicing law firm to give the students pro bono experience they need to be able to qualify, but equally it's there to help the local community with legal advice. So lots of interesting things about secure lines and how that works and confidentiality, but it's just another really good example of how learning experience is becoming more vocational and is blending into more sort of training activities and reaching out to the community. And I think that's me done. So I will stop sharing. And hopefully you heard all that, and that was okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. We do have a couple of questions from the chat, so I'll relay those first. But if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask directly, please do put your Zoom hand up now, I guess. So the first question from the chat I've got is, do you have any examples of how these new ways of using space map onto good pedagogical outcomes? I love some of the spaces that have been shown, but really want to align good space with how to use it. It's a good question.
It's a great question. And the short answer is no. One of the things that we wanted to propose, and we were quite excited about talking to you as an institution and talking to other institutions, is how we and institutions themselves get feedback on not only attainment, but also on feedback of experience from everybody about whether we've created the right spaces, the right typologies in the right places. I had a similar question a couple of years ago at Sconnell. Kris, you mentioned Sconnell about libraries and about how you measure attainment related to good library provision. It's really difficult to do because it's study space, it's information, quality of information. There is no direct correlation that you can see in terms of increased use of libraries necessarily with attainment. You kind of know it's a good thing because students are saying, the staff are saying, they're great spaces to teach in, and it's a great experience, and I can concentrate, I can work, I've got access to great information, I can problem solve. So I'm afraid I don't have a really good answer on that, other than there's kind of indicators of general academic performance elsewhere within the schools and faculties. The other thing you can measure, obviously, I think I mentioned it about the technology. I mean, just in terms of the attraction of spaces, of these non-timetabled spaces, we can measure them in terms of hotspots, or measuring them with your mobile phone connecting to the Wi-Fi. So you kind of know how many people are in spaces. In libraries, you know how many people are going through turnstiles, but you don't know how necessarily how that's impacting in terms of actual grades and attainment, which we know is incredibly important in terms of return on investment of why universities would spend on these kind of facilities. It has to be about attainment and the return on investment.
Thank you. There were also a couple of questions or comments, and something I'd noted about or around some of your concepts where you've got a lot of open space and lots of things going on in different areas of the space. So it maybe wasn't quite clear how those discrete activities are divided in terms of space. I mean, how would that work? Wouldn't there be lots of noise kind of transferring from one activity and disturbing other activities? And also in terms of people's individual workspaces.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Well, I mean, we've seen a trend, say, in learning commons and libraries towards more activity-based and most social activities within libraries. People are not sitting in carousel spaces very quietly and studiously and just having access to a library that's 90% books. There's been a real change in those kind of environments to more social activities, online digitization of collections. So inevitably those spaces have become more louder and more social. So in our designs, that's been reflected in thinking about how we deal with acoustics, the kind of materials that we put within those spaces, the kind of segregation of those spaces. In some instances, it's about noise impacting in terms of quiet spaces, or it's vice versa, where you might have noisy areas impacting on open plan areas in terms of confidential conversations, for example. So it's the ability to be able to design and people to work in these kind of environments. It's important to have variety, and most of our student centre projects will have, for example, they'll have quiet or silent studies areas in them. They'll have particular zones of working that allow that variety and experience. but also you picked on the point about furniture itself and about that one of the conversations we've been having is that you see our third space concept, everything is engineered in that concept, deliberately so, to sort of define an activity and then try and create the architecture and the IT and everything you need around it. The reality of it is, in real projects, is there's a balance between the two. You need to have that flexibility of open plan areas that aren't configured by particular furniture or walls or structures, to be able to create a nice balance between the two. So you're not socially engineering every activity and unable to work because, oh no, I can only go in this particular space and this has been designed for one thing. So I think it's very much a journey of discussion in every instance. Every job is different. Every access to different facilities around that space is different. Of existing assets, and you treat it, as a separate brief about what the right balance is. So I think we definitely can create, quieter spaces and more studious spaces if that's required.
Thank you. So we've got a question from Will, who's got his hand up. Would you like to?
Hello, thank you. Yes, I just wanted a really interesting presentation today. I enjoyed that. But one of the questions I had, and I think sort of maybe some of the comments in the chat sort of reflect that it could be an issue. But how do you? So going alongside using these different spaces, they're clearly sort of disruptive to a greater or lesser extent to how, I guess, many people would traditionally see the delivery of particularly higher education. Do you sort of, what sort of like focus is there on teacher training and sort of trying to put equal thought and consideration into sort of revolutionizing the approach towards delivery and getting the most out of these spaces, alongside the sort of the change in physical? And I don't mean just like, what buttons to press, but like, you have these new environments, how to effectively deliver using them.
Yeah. My experience is that most of these projects and conversations with other universities is that there is a very welcome trend to having ongoing conversations and understanding with teaching and learning groups, educators and experts that are assisting us as designers in a greater understanding of need. And that's a continuous dialogue. And it's a dialogue. There are a number of institutions that are constantly talking to staff and students about the nature of facilities. And we've shown you the York example. I understand that you have some pilot spaces as well. The ability to have an ongoing program of piloting of space, students love it, staff love it. It's something that they can see an investment in them and their views about how space and how teaching and learning is experienced on campus. So I'll give you an example of a very bad, something that happened a few years ago that I heard in a particular university that has a very shiny management school up in the north of England. And the academic body, management school, lawyers, and they insisted on, I think, 250 cellular offices in the building, central corridors, and one tiered lecture theatre. And they did so because that was their experience of an understanding of what they needed. Yet that particular building teaches conflict resolution and collaboration and international work. And there was a complete disconnect between what the institution taught and thought and the delivery of space, the brief in terms of the articulation of how that then building was built. It didn't reflect the values. And you can see sometimes that disconnect happens because there isn't a constant dialogue or opening of eyes to academic students and staff to what's happening in the wider world where things are really successful. So we're reliant on that dialogue, on our understanding as designers, but also you as an institution about what is best practice, what is leadership, and not just change for change's sake, but really recognizing the enrichment of curriculum through this creation of fantastic spaces and use of IT and all sorts of things. So I would defer to Kris and Claire on how that program is happens at the LSE, but it is now expected across the sector that level of engagement happens all the time, so we deliver the best as possible.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I was think it's sometimes quite chicken and egg. Do we develop the spaces first that then are ready for the different ways of different types of pedagogies, or do we do that first and then develop the spaces? Or I guess it's a balance. You kind of do things gradually, but it's always an interesting question.
I agree. I mean, I think it's a balance of both. There's always going to be core curriculum delivered in a 30, 60 person seminar room. That kind of cohort will always be there, and obviously ratios of student staff would determine what that cohort is in terms of education experience. I just think it's that balance of going back to that 2/3 third, the ability to put money aside to know that instead of building amazing one-off institutional buildings that are kind of fixed in their program and layout, the ability to think about space all the time is being in evolution. And one university a few years ago said to me, I want the furniture to fall apart in 5 years' time. I mean, that sounds quite controversial, but because it forces me to have to replace it instead of buying a sofa that it looks like it's been there for 100 years. The point is, I need to change things, and I need to reflect different ways of working and expansion and contraction and different courses. And so it should be an absolute fluid program of remodeling and engagement about what you need in terms of facilities and resource.
I guess there are then questions around sustainability, and buying furniture that's going to fall to bits doesn't sound very sustainable.
But I'm sorry, can I say something? I mean, I would.
Yeah, go for it, John.
Sorry. Yeah.
Go. Yeah.
So one thing is, what slightly I find is, discomforting is that you seem to know what academics want. So, for instance, if no matter what I'm doing research on, I need to concentrate. Half of the time I'm sitting at my desk and I need quietness. But at the same time, somebody comes in, maybe a student or researcher, and we need to discuss loudly our ideas. And for that, we don't need an open space where we are where we're disturbing others, but we need a closed office, soundproof, and don't have to walk to a conference office for that. I want to be both able to be on my own and not disturb others. And for that, the closed cubicle, not cubicle, but an office that is soundproof is very important to me. If you say we're all making this flexible and open space, I see that being taken away from me, and that's. I wouldn't come to university anymore if that happens like that.
Yeah, but I've been doing my job for about 26 years, working with universities and obviously working with academics, and there is obviously a concern about has been pre-COVID. About open plan working and the ability to concentrate, the ability to spend time, thinking and also having confidential conversations. And there is no agenda from estates departments or powers that are trying to disenfranchise you or in any way affect the way that you work. What there is a move away from, perhaps, is a sense of ownership of space. So what you're talking about is a space in which you can carry out a certain activity that you need for a certain amount of time. And we're moving away from a kind of hierarchy or reward structure of space to say that guy over there gets an office twice as big as the guy next to him because he's paid more money. In a kind of commercial world, what we're saying is that you're likely to have a more bespoke resource that you need at a certain time. So there would be access to, in a future world, and I'm not saying we're on that, it's going to happen tomorrow, but you would have access to, a quiet, confidential space or thinking space that you would be able to book and know that you would have access to it. You would have access to a meeting room that, you know, possibly if you're not using that space as a meeting room, somebody else can use it as a meeting room. So there's a greater efficiency of that space. So there is a move towards that kind of intelligent thinking of what do you need? What are your resources and facilities that you need that are the best in the world? Because we can spend more money on them if we don't have lots of underutilization of space that we're spending lots of money on and adding to our carbon footprint and all those things. So there is, we use a phrase about, you know, for every one negative, we need to give you 10 positives in our job, because people are nervous about change and nervous about losing, you know, they identify with research equipment, or they identify with the status of their position, or, you know, the younger generation are less precious about that. You know, they are more nomadic, they are more used to working in different environments, they're used to throwing away technology and replacing it with the next device. And I think there's a trajectory towards that kind of thing, but I want to reassure you that the sanctity of quiet space, of thinking space, and all the things that are important to you are not going away. They're just going to change in the future in terms of the balance of those things on the campus.
Thank you. That's perfectly timed, John. We've reached our end of the session and reached our time limit. So I just wanted to say a big thank you for coming along and talking to us today. And it was really good. Thank you. A virtual round of applause. Or thank you.
I mean, we're delighted. We just kind of gone across lots of things in a very kind of superficial way. If there are specifics about workplace or teaching spaces that people would like a further discussion and dialogue on, and feedback to help us as designers, we'd be delighted to be involved in that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone. See you at the next seminar, whenever that will be.
To decide what the theme is first.
Yeah, we do.
Suggestions, please.
Yeah, any suggestions welcome.